for everyone here tonight is that you also learn to search for voices that are not just captives to the hyper-partisan discussions that so often fill cable news and online sources. Find your reliable people like Dr. Nicolás and Dr. Doshi, who are thinking beyond the shallowness of some of those discussions. So Dr. Tilak Doshi was very gracious about my enthusiasm about his article, and he agreed to join us in Chapel Hill for this quickly planned diplomatic discussion. I'm so grateful that he's here. Dr. Doshi comes to us from London, England, where he serves as energy editor at the Daily Skeptic. He comes by way of years in Singapore. He's held numerous appointments in academia, at research institutes, and in oil companies. And before moving to London, he served as a visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and National University of Singapore, one of UNC's most important strategic partners. It was during his time in Singapore that Dr. Doshi and Dr. Nicolás met each other. And here we are many years later, welcoming Dr. Doshi back to Chapel Hill to discuss a topic on which he is profoundly an expert. Dr. Doshi's article that Peter shared with me was published on January 2nd, just 4 days after Maduro was removed from Venezuela. And it articulated how the United States could in fact benefit from taking oversight of Venezuela's oil sales. At the top of his list, and I'm going to quote, he said this is a ramification: tilting power toward non-OPEC producers in the Americas and sharply curbing the room China and Russia once had to use Venezuela as a strategic beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. This is not only regime change, which he's now backed off of, as we've discussed, it's an energy security doctrine in action. Slide. On this slide, you will see the story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. A month ago, Trump's Venezuela oil grab worries OPEC. And next, a story from The Economist, which says, today the world looks more unsettling for Xi Jinping, and goes on to talk about the impact on China of the loss of its foothold in Venezuela. The reporters are covering this issue well, in my opinion, now, but it took them a while. These stories were published in the Wall Street Journal 5 days after Dr. Doshi first got it off the mark, and then The Economist 13 days after Dr. Doshi published its article. So how fortunate are we to have him here with us tonight? It is a distinct honor to have one of the world's leading thinkers on the geopolitics of energy. Dr. Doshi is an expert here, but he is aware of his limits. He will not speak to the ethics or legality of America's actions in Venezuela. I'm happy to talk about that, and so if you do want to discuss it, find me afterwards at the pizza reception. If there's sufficient interest in this topic, I would like to invite another speaker to come and work through those issues with us. It's a really important topic, but it's not tonight's topic. So as part of the Diplomacy Initiative, we like to give students the space to really understand how the world works, including some of the intricacies. I think, what was it you said, that oil is the master resource? It drives everything. We're going to dive deep tonight under Dr. Doshi's direction. It's a complicated subject. He'll deliver a hefty presentation that will help us understand how the oil industry works and what America's oversight of Venezuelan oil sales means for the U.S., the region, and the world. So at that point, it's time to welcome Dr. Doshi to the podium. Please join me. Big round of applause.
Let me start off by thanking Ambassador Stevenson for this very kind invitation and for the warmth and graciousness you showed me this last day. Carolina Inn is a great place. I stayed there once before. I didn't notice it that much, but it's a wonderful building. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Peter, for being the friend that you've been for the last 40 years and for making this happen. Without you, this would not have happened. And thanks to the team of Global Affairs, UNC Global Affairs, for putting all this together. And thank you all for coming. I'll try to be short and sharp, half an hour or less. And let me start with qualifiers, the lack of qualifications. I'm not a Latin America expert. I'm not a Venezuela expert. Neither do I have very strong opinions on legality and illegalities of US foreign policy. And I'm rather limited in my entire knowledge of Latin American affairs. My focus has been on oil and gas in other exciting parts of the world, Middle East and Asia. I hope that the Latin American focused people here also look at Asia now and then and come and visit me in Singapore if you ever come through. So let me start. Okay, so brief introduction, then we'll talk a bit about Venezuela in the past century before we've seen the expropriation that took place after Hugo Chavez took over. And then the thing that shocked us all with the move, the removal of Maduro under the Trump administration. And a last slide on just what the natural resource curse can be. Trump's removal and capture of Nicolás Maduro, de facto US takeover of Venezuela's oil future. Now I put a question mark there. What does actual takeover of Venezuela's oil look like? What do we expect it to be? Now there are no boots on the ground. Under no scenario can you expect an invasion and occupation of Venezuela by US or any other power. That's not going to happen. So the US influence on the sale and marketing of Venezuelan oil, under what terms and conditions, those are the things that will determine just the long-term outcome of the capture and the taking of Maduro to the Southern District of New York for this legal case. So, to the extent that Venezuela's oil heads towards a future with cooperation with the US, with a less corrupt approach to using their own oil resources, more open and hospitable environment for foreign investment, then it will have an impact, a significant impact on the global petroleum chessboard. It tilts power over to the non-OPEC producers in the Americas. Now, Venezuela is still an OPEC member, and whether it's actually a member or not matters less than whether Venezuela is capable of increasing its output under these altered conditions and becoming a major player. And if it does become a major player, then its relations with America will determine how it cooperates or doesn't cooperate with OPEC. Now, with OPEC, we've got the OPEC Plus, which have led to some coordination of movements between Russia and Saudi Arabia, the two heavyweights on OPEC. And with the loss of Venezuela, with a potential loss of Venezuela into the future, we will see OPEC being reduced as a result by not having such a large player, a potential large player like Venezuela not being within OPEC. It will also curb China's and Russia's strategic beachhead in Western Hemisphere to the extent that the US and Venezuela can have closer relations. The US will have influence to determine what sort of investments and what sort of involvement Russia and China can have in Venezuela. And these are not just issues of influence and informal political relations, but also legality. So for now, we'll see whether China will pursue its legal interests in its investments in Venezuela after this move by the US. We'll have to wait and see how that changes. Middle East producers, of course, will face a challenge again with a potential Venezuela that produces 2 to 3 million barrels per day, which it may well do so under changed conditions. Okay, so stepping back a bit. So for almost a century, Venezuela's ascent as an oil power has been inseparable from US technology, US capital, and US oil companies, US expertise. By the late 20s, Venezuela was already well on its way to becoming a major oil exporter from its previous position as an agriculture exporter. So companies like Standard Oil, Gulf Oil were among mainly US, over 100 foreign oil companies operating in the country. And at that time, in 1943, the hydrocarbon law, for example, introduced a 50-50 profit split, which became quite a model for the rest of the world, actually. And it found what we call a positive sum game, where foreign enterprise found it valuable to be there in order to drill for oil and get their profits. And the host country found it profitable to have those foreign investors in their country in order to promote the development of their country by drilling for oil and gas. 1976, nationalization created the country's national oil company called PDVSA. And this was in common with the rest of the world. In the Middle East, over the 60s and 70s in particular, decolonization led to nationalization, and oil countries creating their own national oil companies to take care of their export sectors. Now, PDVSA remained a very professional company, professionally run by competent engineers and administrators and economists for quite some time, until around the 2002 period when Hugo Chavez, in his increasing standoff with the US and an emphasis on socialist ideology, led to PDVSA being a place to reward loyalists, to reward supporters of his party, rather than good engineers and good administrators. So the damage started soon after the mass firings of very competent people from PDVSA. In fact, I was in the Middle East and I met some Venezuelans who all at great cost themselves left the country, but they had no choice. You could see the tragedy that was unfolding in the country. These engineers from PDVSA ended up in Houston, in oil cities like Calgary, and in Saudi Arabia, where I happened to be working at that time. Okay, thank you. So the mass firings began in 2002. Maduro takes over in 2013, and you can see the slide from over 3.5 million barrels per day before 1999, when when Hugo Chavez took over. And then you see that steep slide. Now, I don't have that line, and Ambassador Stevenson will talk about it later, but the sanctions only happened in 2017. So it's immediately evident that the damage, the sanctions played a minor role, if any, because the slide was already apparent early on. Okay, Trump's Monroe Doctrine. So the national security strategy that was announced just a month or two ago explicitly revived the Monroe Doctrine as an energy dominance strategy. Since Trump's first term, but in particular his second term, he has talked about energy dominance, making America a great oil and gas producer. And it was to reassert and enforce US preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. And to deny extra-regional powers like China and Russia the ability to own or control strategically vital assets in the Western Hemisphere. So it's quite a sea change, it's quite a dramatic change. The NSS was quite a dramatic change. You see the evolution of the US from being a global policeman to saying, look, Europe, you take care of your own defense requirements, we are your ally, but you're not going to free ride on us anymore. You need to take care of your own affairs in Europe. We are interested in you succeeding, but we're not going to take your responsibility over for you like we have done since 1945 via NATO. So that was one of his messages. Now, it all depends on what we mean by reassert and enforce US preeminence. If it means informal influence in Latin America towards a more liberal economic environment, it could well lead to a positive change both for people in Latin America, in Venezuela in particular, as well as for US oil companies to promote the development of that industry. The seizure of Maduro, of course, showed you the operation of Trump's interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. Very muscular, but it was not regime change, as Ambassador Stevenson reminded us. It was just the removal of Maduro and his wife, and the next in line took over as interim president, Ms. Delgado, and we will see the path towards towards a program, a path towards new elections, because right now it's an interim regime and it is not legitimized yet with proper elections. And hopefully we hear announcements of that in the coming weeks or months. Now, Washington intends to set the rules for production, refining, and export of the world's largest proven oil reserves, Venezuela's. Can it succeed? Now, we are not talking of a takeover of the industry. We are talking of the ability of the American government, of the US government to work in close alliance with the new regime in Venezuela for a win-win kind of outcome. Can it succeed? We'll have to see. None of us can predict the future. So Chevron's, of the companies, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, which were very large players in Venezuela, left after their assets were expropriated. They are still owed funds by Venezuela, so that matter is not settled. Chevron still operates there, and these are candidate companies that will return to Venezuela if the terms of law and commerce and political security are resolved in a positive way in Venezuela. Now, the CEO of ExxonMobil was quite blunt in his statement. He's saying that Venezuela is uninvestable, and he should know his company was expropriated twice over. As they said, once bitten, twice shy. This is twice bitten, third time extremely shy. So he very reasonably makes a statement that it's a great effort to be able to bring normality back to Venezuela away from his 20 years of socialism and politicization of a very extreme ideology. So only time will tell us. Okay, I will not get into real technical details, but just some basics on oil, just in order to appreciate what has happened. Now, this is oil. It's got many characteristics, chemical and physical, but the two things that matter most, because that shows you roughly the cost of refining it into useful products like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and so on, depend on these two. The gravity, the specific gravity in oil, they use a specific measure called API gravity. And sulfur. The more sulfur it has, the more sour it is, the more expensive it is to refine it. And the heavier it is, the lower the number of API, lower than 25, it means it's very heavy. And Venezuelan crudes is less than 10 API. So Venezuelan crude will be way down this chart here and way to the right, beyond the axis. So it's very heavy. It even needs diluents to mix with it in order for it to actually flow and to refine it. So it's heavy oil and it's cheap because it's hard to refine it. It's so heavy. So next slide, please. So now it tells you WTI is West Texas Intermediate, there's Alaska North Slope ANS, there's Arab Medium ARM, and Maya is a Mexican crude. So it gets heavier and heavier as we go to the right. And Venezuelan crude is even heavier and further to the right. Now, as you go heavier, you can see that black bottom part of that stack chart being larger and larger. That's the sludge. That's the stuff that people use to run ships on. Is residual fuel oil. Some power stations also use it. It's the heaviest, and you use that for road building as well, asphalt. So heavy oil, in some ways, is needed for that black portion, that heavy residue. It's called residue. It's what remains after you've heated above 1030 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide. So again, don't worry about the numbers, but the important thing is delayed coking is a particular process which is quite complex, and over there on to the right, if you see the column numbers, number 2 says delayed coking, and the complexity number is 7.6. So it's quite complex, and there are other types of processes that are also complex. But it's complex because heavy oil, you need to get out the impurities, you need to treat it and so on. And the point I want to make is that US, among all the refining regions in the world, the US is very focused on delayed coking. Because over time, US oil industry evolved in order to take crude like Venezuelan oil into their system. So they are optimized for crudes that are produced by countries like Venezuela, and there's a lot of heavy oil from Canada as well. Okay, next slide. So again, don't worry about the numbers too much, but if you look at the most bottom right number, 11, the margin, the final net margin, what you make out of processing a barrel. If you've got coking, you make $11 profit a barrel using Maya, which is a heavy crude. And as you go, you get less and less value if you use lighter crudes like the first column, which is West Texas Intermediate, WTI, and ARM. So again, this is all just to show you one thing, which is that there is a partnership of sorts between the US refining industry and Venezuelan oil, because these industries grew up together.
So, okay, now that we got numbers out of it, there's another number that often you will see it in the papers and so on. Venezuela has 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. Now, by definition, what do we mean by proven reserves? It means given technology and given prices. Now, if prices go down, much of this oil may not be worthwhile in exploiting. You'll just leave it in the ground because it doesn't make sense. So that number shifts not only by the technology and the price of the oil, but also the kind of infrastructure that you have. And the last 20 years has seen Venezuela go really down in terms of the industry. So it will take a long time it will take considerable effort to make it produce again to the levels that it did produce. Now, for the US, it widens the area of interest that it has. It not only just gets Canadian oil and Mexican oil, but it will also get Venezuelan oil, and there are other oil discoveries in Latin America, like Guyana, for example. And Brazil has got oil sands as well. So what we see is a hemisphere of the US, of America, becoming a counterweight to the great producing region of the Middle East and OPEC, including Russia, OPEC plus. So US now, it is, in the oil industry, we call them a full spectrum player. It produces a lot of light oil. All the US shale oil is light oil. Now it's got the heavy oil side of it covered as well, assuming that everything goes ahead and we have a good scenario for Venezuela's development, which depends a lot on what the Venezuelans themselves do within the country politically. Okay, next slide. So it also affects Canada in a particular way. Alberta is a major producing region, and they produce a lot of heavy oil, and they are well connected to the US grid of pipelines already. So what Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, was alluding to in his Davos speech, but also by his actions previously, is that, look, we can export our oil to China. We don't have to just depend on the US as our customer. So it was like a bargaining play. But now that Venezuela may come under the US influence, the US may well say, okay, go ahead, we'll see where you go because we don't need your oil. If Venezuela turns out to be a major producer in the next 2, 3, 5 years' time, once the necessary investments are going. So the interrelations between Canada and the US, and between the Canadian federal government and the province of Alberta, which is getting increasingly frustrated by the federal government in Canada the federal government in Canada has been quite anti-oil and gas in their approach towards green policies, and that has put Alberta at a disadvantage as well. And Alberta may well have more interest in staying with close relations with the US instead of playing the Mark Carney line and saying, hey, look, we are big boys here, we're going to negotiate with the Chinese, we don't need the Americans. It's a very dangerous game that Prime Minister Mark Carney is playing in Canada, and we'll have to see just how it turns out. Now it also forces China, which has put an extensive amount of resources into Venezuela over the years, to see whether, so when they invested in Canada, in Venezuela, the Chinese got their repayments back by reduced prices for Venezuelan crude oils back to them. So they got discounted Venezuelan crude oil in return for their loans and for their investments in Venezuela. Now that the US has the upper hand in Venezuela, and we don't know what that upper hand means really. It all depends on the relationship between, going forward between Venezuela, the new political forces that come out in Venezuela after the removal of Maduro, and the US government. Both China and Moscow. Moscow has had also major investments in Venezuela. And now, whether Russian prepayments can become vulnerable to US influence in Venezuela. Again, these are all complex matters because the lawyers will start fighting. It takes years and years for this thing to be litigated in courts around the world. It also, of course, depends on formal and informal political influences and diplomacy between countries like Russia, China, Venezuela, and the US. Now, to the extent that Venezuela can be reconstituted as a major producer in that good scenario, that oil will be sold in dollars. That makes a big difference. It's called the petrodollar system. After the Second World War, the entire oil industry was based on the sales of crude oil paid for in US currency. And the petrodollar was very important because by then the US was off the gold standard, and the Saudis ensured that their price would be in dollars, and they would use that dollars to buy US bonds, for example. So the petrodollar system is an extremely important one, and if Venezuela comes successfully into the American orbit, into a hemispheric position, then it will be to the benefit of the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, and it will be at the cost to Moscow and Beijing. In the Western Hemisphere, we see the US shale, Canadian oil shales, Brazilian pre-salt, Guyana's newfound reserves, and now Venezuelan heavy crude. So lots of resources in the Western Hemisphere. The greater the resources in this hemisphere, the less Washington depends on exposure to Eurasia and to the Middle East. They're less hassled by matters of oil and politics in Eurasia and in the Middle East. If Venezuela does get revitalized in the near future, then a US-anchored Americas looks very promising and robust going ahead, because energy is a major part of. Without energy, there is no political power, and energy is so important to it. Europe has been so tied up with this net zero constraints. They're anti-fossil fuel and full renewable energy, that they have in fact become less and less of an important player in global affairs. Right, so this is a good map to show you just how the hemisphere is a powerhouse with respect to oil and gas, and how the US can play a central role in this. I think we should go into the last slide here. Okay, so, in a way, it was an audacious move to just go into a country, literally kidnap the leader and take him out of the country. Now, we're not here to talk about the legality or illegality about it, but it will be very difficult to argue against someone who will say, hey, look, this is neo-imperialism. This is an oil man, he loves his oil, and he's a neo-imperialist. He just grabbed Maduro because Maduro wasn't playing the kind of rules of game that the Trump administration wants. There's some truth to it, but on the other side, the massive catastrophe to the working people, the normal household in Latin America and Venezuela in particular, because of 20 years of a failed socialist experiment, is the other side. Now, two wrongs don't make a right, but in an imperfect world, the loss of Maduro, closer relationships between Venezuela and the US, and yes, informal influence by the US on the running of Venezuelan sales, oversight of Venezuelan sales of crude oil, may well be the best possible scenario for normal people in Latin America. So, it's a context in which one needs to appreciate what has happened. Now, in 1975, political leader Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, he described oil as a devil's excrement because he saw how oil can be a curse rather than a benefit. Because if it's used wrongly, it becomes a source of corruption, and many major oil countries blessed with oil resources have gone down that route. Iran, Mexico, these are all countries that had tremendous resources that went down the tube because of ideology and because of corruption. Juan Pablo was aware of that. Now, instead of the resource curse, restored partnership with US firms with a credible constitutional transition to a genuinely elected alternative, a new regime in Venezuela which looks at, in a practical, professional way, how to run a country, then we may well see Venezuela's resources being used for the benefit of Venezuelan people. Let's hope that's the scenario that actually works out. And Trump's adventure may well have proven the right thing. We don't know, but let's end there. Sorry for going over time.
Because we're almost in Q&A time.
Sorry about that, yeah.
And you know, I think, Dr. Doshi, the first question I was going to ask you was about that decline in Venezuelan oil production, and really that it's not about U.S. sanctions, but you did such a good job explaining that. I'm going to go to the second question. And it's about the price of oil. And I want to ask if you can help us understand, why do different countries have different ideal prices of oil? In your article, you write, persistently low oil prices represent a double-edged sword for the U.S. While they benefit customers through cheaper gasoline, potentially boosting U.S. motorist sentiment and favoring the incumbent administration, they could undermine domestic shale producers, who generally require prices above $60 a barrel to sustain operations and growth. You also mentioned in your article that Saudi Arabia wants a price of $100 a barrel. That's what's ideal for them. They need that to make their budget work, their finances work. So can you unpack this for us? How are oil prices determined, and why do different actors, different countries, different operators, different populations disagree on what the ideal price of oil is? And as you said to me, that's its own lecture.
It's a huge topic, but as an economist, I am compelled to say it's all demand and supply. So ultimately, it is demand and supply. But there's so many grades of oil, there's so many players in the industry. So finding even the correct price to reflect demand and supply itself is quite a thing, because it all depends on where you can load the cargo. It's not like buying an apple off the cart of your grocer, right? You got to have delivery of the oil. So there's so many aspects to the pricing. But ultimately, the way it affects you and I and all of us here is how much does it cost to drive your car, for example, and that's a major issue. Every government is aware of the price of motor gasoline because that affects their chances of re-election, right? So that's important. On the other hand, oil is a master resource. It goes into everything that you do. The transport, the electricity, the plastic, the clothes that you wear, they're all at the end embodiments of the output of oil and gas when manufacturing started, the process started. So the oil price seeps everywhere. And sorry to be harsh, but there is no such thing as a fair price. There's only demand and supply. And it's unfair only if someone monopolizes it and stops it from, controls its supply. And OPEC has tried that to not very successfully over the years. And now with losing Venezuela, they may even be even less successful. But you want a happy medium. You don't want oil prices too low such that the US oil production suffers because US oil producers require $60 to $70 a barrel. If it's much above $70 a barrel for oil, then your gasoline for your car becomes expensive, and President Trump wouldn't like that either, or any president in office wouldn't like that. So you want somewhere in between.
$60 and $70 is a sweet spot.
It's
for
somewhere
a
around.
country like the U.S. that both produces oil, but not cheaply.
Right.
It costs the Saudis $10 a barrel to get it out. But for us, it's really much higher to get that shale out, the shale oil out, right?
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
And your point about the $100 per barrel requirement for Saudi Arabia is it takes about an average of $5 a barrel to get it out of the ground. Five. As low as 5.
Okay.
And you sell it for 60,
Yeah.
70, depending on the price that but they use that oil to support so many things, paying not a very productive bureaucracy and all that. So their budget deficit is based on oil. And for them, if the price of oil is below 100, then their budget deficit starts going funny as well. So they depend on oil very much. So it depends on different parts of the world, how they depend on oil, whether they are producers or consumers.
And right now it's sitting in the sweet spot. It was below, but all the saber rattling about Iran has driven it back up to about $65 a barrel,
Yes.
depending on the time. Does anybody have a question? I'm going to call you to the mic so we can see. Here's Dr. Fogg.
Thank you so much, Pat. In the national language of Singapore, terima kasih banyak atas presentasinya. I got a question actually because I think Venezuela functions a bit funny, not only in the politicization of how you're getting out of the ground, but my understanding is that they also politicized who they would send it to, when and how. And that this is now coming to a head in Cuba. That Venezuela was sending a set amount of petroleum to Cuba, and that was keeping the Cuban economy alive. And Trump is now blocking that off. I wonder first, what do we think the consequences of that will be? And second, if there are other entanglements like that we should keep our eye on.
Yes, those are very important issues. Now, certainly without that aid, Cuba will be even more in trouble than it already is. I mean, Cuba is really a broken state, power blackouts all the time and so on. Now, the extent to which the US can actually tell Venezuela, you can't sell to this, you can't sell to that, I rather suspect that the US doesn't have a complete 100% control on those sorts of matters. Now, Cuba, certainly because Cuba is, already sanctioned and embargoed for decades by the US, and extending that to blocking Venezuelan oil is not a very great step change. But for them to say Venezuela has to sell according to US interests, that would be too blatant, and I doubt whether US even needs to do that, really. Now, we saw a little bit about this issue with the US, we were talking about it earlier, Investor, about the US telling India not to buy Russian oil. We'll see what happens. the Indians, like the Chinese and many other powers, they just can't be told what to do and what not to do. We'll have to see how this pans out, but certainly India and Prime Minister Modi do not want to be seen as puppets of the Trump administration jumping to their requirements. So we'll have to see on those kinds of issues. But every time you use that weapon, sanctions, the more you use it, the less meaningful it becomes. I mean, Russia is now under its 19th sanction or 20th sanctions package by the Europeans. And who are suffering is the Europeans. The Russians are not suffering as much as the Europeans are, believe it or not. So sanctions is a dish best served sparingly, I guess.
We have another question over here. Would you like to
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a great presentation. You mentioned something to the effect of that you would hope the people of Venezuela would benefit from all this production. Based on the history of money and power, isn't there really a 0% chance that's actually going to happen? And number two, whatever happened to alternative energy?
Okay.
Whatever happened to?
Alternative energy.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Your first question about the zero chance of a country turning around and improving itself. I studied Indonesia and I did my dissertation on the Indonesian because they're a major oil producer as well, oil and gas producer, and they had the least of all problems. In the early years, they were going down the trajectory that Iran, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil all started going down, which is spending all that money, corruption rampant, the rest of the industry and agriculture suffering because that sector, the oil sector or the natural resources sector dominated everything. Now, if you have a reasonable administration like Indonesia had, and they had a group of people called the Berkeley Mafia. They were actually, many of them were students from Berkeley. And they actually avoided allowing the oil riches to flood the country, inflate the place, and allow corruption to take over. Instead, they did not use that money in big projects, but used it in agriculture, in ways that improve productivity, without flooding the country and allowing inflation and an appreciation of the country's currency to destroy the rest of the world. So I'm not as pessimistic as you are. I can see Venezuela potentially riding a path which is fairly liberal economically, but not necessarily a mere puppet of an administration in power in Washington, D.C. So, and I don't think there's a 0% chance of that. As they say, the hangman wonderfully concentrates the human mind. The Venezuelans know, the political elites there know that their survival depends on a reasonable approach to the oil industry and on reasonable relations with the U.S. Now, only time will tell whether that reasonable outcome can come about. But I'm not that pessimistic. I put it far higher than 0% chance. I hope I answered the question.
The price that Venezuelan oil is bringing now is higher because it's not having to be sold at a discount. So when it's going to the Gulf refineries, it's actually going at full market value. So I think it's actually yielding a larger amount than it was under the previous setup there, which was made so because of U.S. sanctions and us tracking down the Russia to go school today.
Right. Yes.
Sir?
Thank you for your time. My question is towards your headline, Reordering Global Oil. So my question is that India is developing a new port in Greater Nicobar Island, which is the first choke point if you enter through the Strait of Malacca. So as you have lived in Singapore, what do you think about its future and the direct competition between India and China in Indian Ocean in coming future?
That's always been a difficult relations between India and China. I think both countries see in their interest to not pursue perpetual problems at the border like has been the case for many decades. But the underlying competition will always remain there. And I don't see that much a change going into the future. It will always be a very difficult relations. And I think if you've got good leadership on both sides, at least they'll manage those difficult relations. But beyond that, they're not going to be buddies. That there'll always be competition between those two. And the Straits of Malacca area is a major choke point, and India's base in the Nicobar Islands is very important to them. Just like China's base in Sri Lanka, which they made, as you might know, is an important issue. So the Indian Ocean is very contested, and it will remain an area of contestation. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much
Oh,
for
sorry. I'll take your question first, and then I'll return to the question about alternative energy. I apologize for that. Okay.
Yeah, I was actually going to follow up on that as well, because I know oil has been considered like liquid gold for the past many decades, but just in the past few years, solar and offshore wind are now cheaper than oil and gas over a few years span, and the profits do turn around. And we've seen outside of the U.S. a lot of like climate action and adherence to the Paris agreements and like future climate action. How do you think that's going to impact in the future the value of oil and how much of a role that plays in political power?
Yeah, very important questions, and I'm glad you brought it up, and your question is related to that as well. Firstly, let's just put some context in this. We've spent, the estimates range enormously, but we spent trillions. It's not exaggeration, over the last 20 to 30 years on net zero or net zero type policies, on subsidies to wind and solar, on all kinds of energy policies that were put across under the net zero kind of Paris Agreement kind of accords. The actual dependence of total global energy, primary energy, was reduced by 2 or 3% over 2 decades. So from 89, it came to 87 or something like that. So when you look at the total energy picture, it's not just oil being run in cars, in the combustion energy, but oil, gas, and coal, in making plastics, in everything that you can imagine, is such a, and as direct energy in industry, for steel and so on, for making cement and all, is so huge that trying to replace it is not mathematically a possible solution within a few years. Now, the role of alternative energy would be very useful if it was allowed to compete in the open marketplace on its own terms. Trying to force it down throats by subsidies and mandates have actually hurt economies. So now, for example, when I speak to Asian audiences, one of the first messages that comes across and resonates very deeply is the statement that let's look at Germany as a classic example, study it carefully, and absolutely do not do anything Germany did. It's the best example of what not to do. And Germany in particular, but Europe and UK in general, they have deindustrialized. Energy poverty has increased in Europe. Many pensioners in the UK where I live now have to decide between heating and eating. I'm not exaggerating. That's how much the price of energy has gone up. Now, certainly wind, solar can have a role to play, but remember these are intermittent energies. The sun sets, the wind dies down, sometimes for weeks on end. Batteries, however cheap they get, are nowhere capable of even approaching a fraction of the problem. Because trying to get larger amounts of batteries, the burden on actually extracting all the metals, all the rare earths, the amount of pollution and damage that will do, and that's again beyond the capabilities. We need to mine like within the next 20 years more than what we've mined since the beginning of time. The magnitudes are phenomenal. So trying to run a modern industrial economy on the basis of wind, solar, and batteries is, as of this stage and for the foreseeable future, not possible. What we should do is promote research and development, let all kinds of energy, like Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom, let all forms of energy bloom, let all forms of technology bloom, but do not allow central planners and bureaucrats telling countries what to do and what not to do, because they almost always get it wrong. So that would be my very short version of it. I think alternative energy has a role to play, but trying to shove it down as a forced solution actually make things worse. I think people get poorer with it.
So we will have a pizza reception next. I'm going to ask you to let Dr. Doshi get out into the atrium before you surround him. So get your pizza and then come and talk to him about this topic. Quick ad, February 24th, Bill Burns, former senior American diplomat, ambassador to Moscow, Jordan. He will, the director of CIA, he will be here February 24th. And Ann Applebaum will come on March 5. She's the leading thinker on that big topic, when nothing seems true, and the impact of disinformation on our democracy. Can I get everyone to join me in a big round of applause